Welcome to Steve Nallon Ghost Stories. This episode, I Was Once a Haunted House, the unusual memoir of a Victorian institution.
I Was Once a Haunted House. I mean, it's the most Gothic, I think, of the stories in the collection. Its voice is very Gothic because it's told by the house itself that was built in 1844. So it's got a, it's got a sort of Gothic revival setting. The language is elaborate and heightened. In terms of the story being Gothic, it's that classic Gothic thing of male power and depravity going unpunished, and not having a way to solve that until a supernatural element comes along. It's a sort of a crime of the past, a wrong that needs putting right, and it's a violation of morality, and all these things are part of the Gothic tradition. Madness. The house, or really the manor house, was built as a school, and then it became a lunatic asylum, and that becomes part of the narrative. So madness is part of the narrative, but also the vulnerability of a woman, which again is very much part of the Gothic tradition, and animalistic. Dracula controls rats, and my house controls the rats that live in it. All big houses will have a rat somewhere. And it's got that sort of sadistic element that ends in, well, without giving too much away, ends in deformity, shall we say, in a big way. So, I mean, that's what, that's my thoughts about the story.
I was going to say this is one of my favorites, but it is. But I'll put a little asterisk next to it, and the reason being, I have a real fear of rats, like an irrational fear of rats. It is my.
Well, we'll get on to Scott's picture later, but I won't get the rats too prominent.
Yeah, usually I'm jealous of your t-shirts, but in this case, it sends a shiver up my spine, and not in a good way. Even talking about rats now, I've got a kind of horrible feeling like over my arms and legs. It is, like I say, it's completely irrational, and strangely, lots of Nosferatu films and things like that I've watched over the years, there's rats pouring all over people. What I will say about this story, this particular story, and I've mentioned this before in lots of places, I love the idea of an inanimate object or a place becoming sentient, and this is a really interesting take on that. And I think when people hear Gothic, they sometimes think old, but even when you're explaining it there, it has modern themes as well, things that translate now.
Well, I think that the story breaks down into three sections, really. The first section is a setup about the history of the house, and all those elements are, become part of the story. There's a foreshadowing of what happens in the end in a little toy theater, where a tiny little mouse is through Pepper's Ghost, which is a 19th century theater effect using glass and so on, where this tiny little mouse actually becomes a giant rat on the stage, and that sort of foreshadows what happens towards the end of the tale. But oddly enough, the climax of the tale comes really about 2/3 of the way into the story, and it's a whodunit, really, because the last section, which again goes back to the 19th century tradition. So often you had a ghost story which came to a conclusion about 2/3 of the way through, and then you discover a letter, or there'd be a painting with a message on the back. And this would then explain what had previously happened. Now, that's a very 19th century way of telling a story. We tend not to do that now. We have sort of want more explanation, but that's sort of how there's a resolution, a sort of denouement in terms of I'm picking all the clues and so on. And that's the quite long final section of it, but it's quite fun because it's got Billy Blooming in it. Going back to your rats, though, really my inspiration was partly Dracula, but partly George Orwell in 1984 and the rats in that. And I read that when I was very young, and just the image from the text, never mind sort of any film versions of it, absolutely terrified me. I'm not really frightened of rats, but just the image of a rat attacking somebody. It's a classic horror thing, and I think it's probably the cruelest part of any of the tales that I've told. I mean, in another tale, I won't say which one, somebody sort of gets eaten, but that's the cannibalistic, but that's a slight cheat. But I think this is the cruelest and probably the most horrible.
It is interesting, isn't it, that cruelness, rats are always linked to that cruelness where, in terms of torture and, even lots of modern films putting them down a tube to get to somebody or trapping somebody. And I seem to just come across those films, even if I'm actively trying to avoid things with them in, whether it's the faces of the rat, because I'm okay with mice and hamsters, gerbils, fine. But, and I used to work in a school where there was like slimy trails near the door on the way, on the outside door to the classroom. And I was talking to the caretaker one day, and he said, and I was like, oh, it must be snails or da-da-da. And he's like, no, that's the slimy end of a rat's tail, tracing it as the rats are trying to get towards the heat in the classroom. And I was like, oh, thanks so much, Michael. I really appreciate you giving me that image. And it stayed with me. That was like 20 years ago. That's stayed with me forever. So, and the children would know in class as well. They would say, they would sometimes draw pictures of rats to scare me, or one child even got a motorized one and let it into the classroom. These are all, it's interesting. You can try and hide from your fears, but they will usually find you.
Yeah, they do. And I mean, the thing about rats, I think, in Dracula is they represent contagion. But there's actually
plague
there's a scene actually in A Christmas Carol which is always cut, which is where Scrooge encounters a dead body under a sheet and refuses to lift the sheet. It's essentially him, and he's terrified, I think, of lifting the sheet. But there's this really terrifying noise of rats digging underneath the door, trying to gain access to the corpse. Now, you can see why sort of modern versions don't include that side of that horror side of Christmas Carol. They tend to go for the redemption side, but
not in the Muppets anyway. I know it's not in that.
Well, it's a real, as I say, it's my most gothic horror story in the collection.
So this week's story extract, a slightly different take on our normal extract readings. Steve, what have we got in store?
Well, there's no story in it, really. It's the moment, it's the chapter before the climax. And what the house does is that it sort of sets it up with a sort of, I don't know, a prose poem on the nature of what is fear.
What is fear? Fear is the child of curiosity, for when the curtain twitches, its hand is compelled to pull it back to see what lurks behind. Fear lives and grows where darkness and shadows shape themselves into that which listens, watches, and waits. Fear is the contagion of deathly silence that in the night seeps deep into your very soul. Fear is the remembrance of being seized by phantoms in troubled and ugly dreams. Fear will not bear reason, for no words can expel a thought beyond denying. Fear is that atavistic horror that comes from ancient lives older than man himself. But above all, fear reminds him that he is, in the end, an animal whose life at any moment can be stolen from him. For one, that night, the darkness would never end. And the fitfulness of every fear that mankind has ever known or felt would be with him until his dying breath.
As the trailer has just shown us, this week's film pairing is The Sentinel from 1975. Now, I hadn't seen this film a long time ago, or it's not a film that I have an attachment to. In fact, this was introduced to me. I was doing a project on film recommendations, and my friend Al, who has a YouTube channel, Al Lacard, and he mentioned The Sentinel. And I watched it and I thought, this is bonkers. This is absolutely bonkers of a film. And I loved it. It's, as people kind of see the film, I'm sure they'll see how this links with your story. The brownstone apartment block is the character. This is wild. It's, well, all I have to say is it's Michael Winner. So there's not a lot of restraint. We have Burgess Meredith, and with his acting style, he's full on chewing the scenery, not a lot of restraint. The building and it's the people who are participating in the story inside this building are so scary. I would call this modern Gothic as well, but it's very 70s. It's there's lots about permissiveness and mixed with that Gothic nature. I'm really interested in what you think about this film as well. I want to add, Steve, and I don't want to. I've no danger of me stealing any of your work here, but I love doing a good Michael Winner impression. So, what was your take on The Sentinel?
I think it's a forgotten film. I think, and it shouldn't be forgotten. I think the issue, I think, for me with it is that Rosemary's Baby does something similar but better.
Yes.
Because what I think that the Sentinel is partly playing with is the paranoia that comes when from city living. Because, you know, when people, we just don't know who our neighbors are. Now, there's an element of sort of fear and paranoia in that, and that is really explored brilliantly in Rosemary's Baby, and it is actually well done in The Sentinel. I just think that Rosemary's Baby is a little bit more powerful in the reveal that pretty much everybody she knows is part of this coven. Without giving too much away, it is a haunted house. It's a haunted apartment because there are ghosts, and it's sort of revealed sort of halfway through the film that they actually are ghosts, and there's some some question mark at the beginning as to whether there are ghosts. She in a similar way to my story. She is very vulnerable as a character. It's female vulnerability, and again, I think that's something that Michael Winner is competent at, I can't say good because it's not really that pleasant what happens to her. Came from a tradition of demon movies and Dennis Wheatley and all that sort of stuff. So it's very 70s from that point of view.
Yeah, I also like, from what I've read, and I've read extracts from the novel. It's very much Michael Winner's take on the novel. There's maybe with Rosemary's Baby a clarity and subtleness that you would probably get that you might not have in this. But there's definitely some wild elements in here, and sometimes there's a salaciousness with his work that maybe isn't always needed, but also seems quite strange now because you don't really see that kind of thing. So it's definitely of its time. I feel the use of Beverly D'Angelo and her partner, and like you say, there's vulnerability there for the character of Alison. She's actually scared of the sexuality of these two women. There's a fear of, there's lots of different types of fear. It's not just like, I'm in a spooky place, I'm in a spooky apartment. There's fear of somebody being more worldly than you, or someone being older and sort of for want of a better phrase, sleazing onto you. There's all this kind of different fear that comes with exactly what you said, of being forced to live in close quarters with people, and you don't get to choose who those people are because it's your apartment block, it's your small village, it's your terraced house, or whatever it is. You're trapped, which kind of takes us into COVID and things like that as well. But anyway,
and there's the climax, without again giving too much away about the climax, that it does involve a choice that could be taking your own life. There's a threat there to take your own life, and that is something that actually does connect with my story, because there's a character in my story who's vulnerable and takes their own life. So there are there are lots of parallels with it. And I mean, there's another side to the Sentinel, and that is just, I love seeing all these old actors, and in the commentary,
wow, what a cast.
Well, what a cast! But also in the commentary, Winner is basically saying, well, you can get these old actors now dead cheap because they don't work very much, and they come in and do a cameo, and you can see how he made his movies because he made them on the cheap.
Like just to list some of them. Yeah, you've got Ava Gardner, John Carradine, Jose Ferrer, Burgess Meredith, as we said, but in smaller roles, Eli Wallach, Christopher Walken, Jerry Orbach, Beverly D'Angelo, but older, Tom Berenger, William Hickey. As you scroll, there's so many names.
And he got them all for threepence.
Yeah, yeah, even like the ones who are either very, very young at the beginning of their career, like someone like, say, Jeff Goldblum, who just pops up briefly, who won't have cost very much, or nearer the end of their career and he's wheeling them in because of their name, and they're also just like, just give me a donation. So,
but it should be. I think it should be watched with a little bit of a sort of a trigger warning nowadays, because there is a little bit of gratuitous sex, which you don't frankly need. But it's a good solid. I think it's a good solid supernatural 1970s drama. Well, here is Scott's wonderful image. The rats. Interestingly, it was the first image that Scott did, but there was a version before this one, which took Spike Milligan's old house. I took a picture of Spike Milligan's old house, and Scott put some rats in front of it. But then I did some research on the internet and discovered that you're not allowed to use an image of a private residence in a publication. So we had to scrap that. And anyway, Scott didn't like that particular one, and he sort of came up with this one. I think this is one he's really proud of, because the two rats that are sort of the biggest two rats are gross, but if you look at one that's staring at you, it's just about to pounce. And it's that image of putting movement in the image of just going to get you. And when you see it, it really does sort of freak you out a bit.
Definitely, I can attest to that.
Well, I think we know you're. Don't look too close and too deep, otherwise you'll be shaking till midnight.
So yeah, it's a really striking image, different to the other images, isn't it? From obviously each one has a different story to tell. But the house, but these rats are key to the story, but also each rat in the picture is telling a different part of the story.
And the rats became friends with the house, because the house was, or the manor house really, was uninhabited for years, and his only friends were the rats. So they sort of became not exactly compliant, but the rats keep being mentioned all the way through the story. And as I said, there's a foreshadowing. We've sort of given away what happens to a degree, but yeah, it's yeah. My story pairing comes from this huge book, Ghost Stories collection, and it's The Shadowy Third by Ellen Glasgow. Ellen Glasgow, an American writer, Victorian, but died in 1945, so she's as much Edwardian as anything. Her stories are very real. They've got a very real feel. There's certainly Gothic elements in them. She was very progressive in her sort of liberal views. This is The Shadowy Third is a sort of, I don't know, prototype feminist story in a degree. But what you have is the power, the man of power, manipulating a very vulnerable woman, who he thinks is mad, or says that she's mad. But then the nurse comes along and realizes that she's not mad. He thinks she's mad because she keeps seeing ghosts, but then the nurse sees the ghost. And without giving too much away, it's a short story and well worth a read. What makes it interesting really is that the ghost is a child. And there's a very strong implication at the end of the story that the child ghost, possibly killed by the man, is the ghost that causes the man's death. It's one of those stories where a lot of it is left unexplained, and you've got to sort of fill in the gaps. And in a way, I think that does connect to my own story, because my story is one of a man who took a vulnerable woman, had an affair with her, but then refused to marry her. That then, without going into the mechanisms of the plot, you've got to work out quite a lot of what has happened in the book, in the backstory. And that is the same, and so it's in the Gothic tradition, but it's also in, I think, the more Edwardian tradition of not revealing too much and not explaining too much, and leaving the reader to work out a lot for themselves.
So, unsurprisingly, for those of people who watch my channel quite a lot, I watch a lot of Michael Winner films, the Death Wish films. This little known or lesser known fact about the Sentinel is really about Michael Winner's choice of individuals to depict characters at the gates of hell. So he chose real disfigured and disabled individuals rather than solely relying on makeup or special effects. Now, there is a lot of points for and against this, and without getting into it too deeply, the decision did lead to some backlash. So there were disability rights groups and some of the cast and crew who disagreed with how he did it, particularly Christina Rains, who played Alison Parker. She admitted she felt uncomfortable during the filming of those scenes. But despite that, a lot of people say it adds to the unsettling atmosphere. So maybe the unsettling atmosphere on a Michael Winner set added to an unsettling atmosphere on the screen, making it probably more shocking than anticipated. I certainly found it more shocking than I thought it was going to be for other films that I'd seen around this time. So that was my I guess, unusual fact, but the more we know about Michael Winner, I guess that's not to be, you know, a massive surprise, but certainly an interesting fact.
Well, mine is more personal in a way, because I was sued by Michael Winner. Because,
Calm down,
and
dear. Calm down.
well, yes. What happened was a friend of mine told me, because I worked with him. I dubbed some stuff in one of his films, and he's one of those people who comes very close to you. He invades your body space. And I was chatting to an actress who'd also done some dubbing, and she said, "Oh yes, he chased me round the room." Now, I mentioned this in an interview. Now, the actress wasn't literally saying he chased her around the room.
Yes.
What she was saying was that he was invading her body space. But the journalist was not terribly experienced, and it ended up in a magazine that Michael Winner read, and he sued me. But it was all a bit of a storm in a teacup, really, because I simply got a lawyer in. I offered an apology, and it cost me a few £100 and £50 donated to a charity which Michael Winner chose. But lots of lawyers then got in contact with me and said, "Look, Steve, don't worry about it. You're one of hundreds. He does this all the time." But he's no longer with us. So I can say that my friend said he chased her all around the room. I've not really talked about the plot so much of my story, but the concept is that somebody who has committed a murder has the ghost of the person they killed always standing next to them. And the only person who can see the ghost is a ghost seer, and their purpose is to bring reconciliation between the murderer and the victim. And the murderer has to repent and the victim has to forgive. And that is the purpose of the ghost seer in my story. And I thought that was an interesting idea. And it's part of our sort of tradition. I'm from a Catholic background, and certainly forgiveness and repentance is all part of that. But that's not what happens in this story. Things go so far. What takes over is righteous anger. And righteous anger is something that is sort of predates our sort of Christian concept of forgiveness. And I think that's my takeaway in a sense. Sometimes maybe there are circumstances where righteous anger should take predominance over repentance and forgiveness. Rather heavy duty sort of theological idea. But you can take away the rats as well. That could be your sort of takeaway image. But it is playing with that theological idea of is repentance and forgiveness always the best option?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question that I think a lot of people who would say they were good people wrestle with. It's something that I think has become quite almost politicized in the sense of, being hardline about, put crime and punishment, or being a sort of namby-pamby on the other side. And you can't necessarily discuss those two things or make judgment calls on things. It's almost a discussion that Michael Winner probably would have had with many people about Death Wish, or people these days would have that discussion about our leadership and leaders in politics. This person seems strong and projects a strong thing because that if somebody does this, then this happens. However, life is shades of different things. We might feel different ways in different situations.
Well, my story, several of my stories have redemption in. We've talked about those, but this one does not. It really is, revenge, and revenge that comes from a very unstable place. But it would make it's the rats, guys. So anyway, so what's your takeaway from the tale?
Well, my takeaway, I suppose, is that the value of having lots of questions in a story, or questioning the reader. And I was thinking this during reading your story, thinking about the companion story and the film. There's a lot going on, and often when there is an object telling a story, or a proper noun, or whatever it is, there's something telling a story, that then we're kind of immersed in a world. We're immersed in whatever's going on to that or around that. They're an observer, and I think that sometimes in modern fiction, every loose end has to be tied up, every question has to be answered, and what I really enjoy is the ambiguity in this kind of tale. I enjoy that because I think some of the greatest stories that I've read have that. Even though sometimes we might get a bit frustrated if we watch a TV show and the last episode doesn't give us tie everything up in a nice bow, we can get frustrated. But actually, I think long term, it feels like there's more value to it. Long term, it feels like something that with a little bit more gravitas. So I know this is going to sound a massive leap, but I think of the last, well, spoilers for a TV program that finished many, many years ago, but the Sopranos last episode, people went back and forth on that, and I actually think now, looking back, I think it was perfect. When who knows what happens, well, and I just think ambiguity is so important.
I think there's some ambiguity at the end of mine, because I think it's only the two people talking in the last section that truly know what happens. So everything else is potentially explainable from other reasons, but the two psychics they have their version. But the news stories, if it got into the news, and it probably would because of the nature of what happened, they would have a different take on it. So yeah, it's an ambiguous ending. The final fake. I'm not going to tell you too much about that because I think the image is intriguing enough. And when I showed this T-shirt to my next door neighbor on the night of Halloween, he said, "Oh, can I borrow it and go out and frighten people?"